I've got a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll share my screen in a minute, and then when the presentation is over, I will unshare my screen so that we can see each other. So let me do this. Oh, did that in the wrong order. Hold on one second. Let me share the screen first. And okay, is that everyone can see the screen?
Yes, good.
Yes, good. All right. So this is a talk that runs through the main thesis of a book that I published recently, which is called Overdoing Democracy: Why We Must Put Politics in Its Place. And I want to just run through sort of some of the main maneuvers in that book. I'm working on a follow-up now that has to do with not putting politics in its place, but when we are doing politics, how can we do that better? Now, one of the main theses of the book is on the left side of the screen. The cure for democracy's ills is not more democracy, but less. Now, I know that that sounds like some anti-democratic slogan. It sounds like the reversal of a very familiar democratic slogan. The task of the talk today is to show that it's not anti-democratic. That is, it's to give some reason to think that healthy democracy depends on our being able occasionally to do something other than politics. I'm going to move pretty quickly through some of the conceptual and empirical stuff that I gesture towards, mainly because a lot of that material is stuff that I'm sure most of you guys who've been good enough to tune in know all about. But if there's something that bothers you in that part or those features of the presentation, we could take it up in the Q&A. One further caveat, and in addition to moving quickly, a lot of the trends that I'm going to talk about, especially in the sort of latter half of the talk, draw heavily from research in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK. They're not exclusive to the United States. I don't know the current status of some of the empirical stuff as it might apply or not, as the case may be in Australia. But even in democracies that are arguably not beset by some of the empirical phenomena that I'm going to be laying out, I think that it's enough to get my thesis up and running, at least well enough, if I can just convince you that democracy is the kind of thing that's always vulnerable to a certain kind of what I'm going to say is overdoing. So let's now look at the sort of lineup or the agenda. So the talk is Overdoing Democracy, the Problem of Polarization. We're going to move, again, pretty briskly in 5 parts. I want to first lay out what I could mean by saying that there's such a thing as too much democracy. I want to separate out 2 different ways in which we talk about there being too much of a good thing. Then I want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we're talking about too much democracy. So say something about what the democracy part of overdoing democracy is. So if you see the first 2 parts, then first part is about what overdoing means. The second part of the talk is about what we mean by, or what I'll mean by, democracy. The third part is, again, going to cover some material that I suspect is familiar to many of you about polarization, and particularly about what I want to distinguish as 2 different phenomena that are related in a particular way. That's part 4, but they're distinct nonetheless, and seeing them as distinct, I think, is diagnostically helpful. That is, I want to separate out what I'm going to call political polarization from what I'll call belief polarization. Belief polarization is roughly what some of you may be familiar with the term group polarization. I think that's, the nomenclature here is always misleading, so we're just we'll have to bear with some stipulations. I think belief polarization is a better term for the phenomenon than group polarization for reasons that maybe will become clear in the course of the talk. Again, part 4 is about the way these two different phenomena interact to create what I think is the real trouble of polarization. Ezra Klein in his books, polarization is the master problem for democracy. Yes and no, in a certain sense. Polarization is the master problem. In a different sense, some kinds of polarization, some forms of polarization are not extricable from democracy, and maybe in some instances polarization is a sign of democracy's health. I think it's the interaction of these two kinds of polarization that make the trouble. And then finally, there's a bit to conclude about what can be done. The talk, as you can even see just in the agenda, is heavily on the diagnostic, and will be pretty quick at the very end about any prescriptive content. But that's for good reason. I think that, there's a lot of pressure put on us political theorists, I think, and political philosophers to produce answers pretty early in the story, or to produce prescriptions pretty early in our thinking about political phenomena. And there's one really, I think, important but not often remembered quote from John Dewey, of all people, although this is pretty sort of garden variety Deweyism. In his book on logic from 1938, Dewey says early, a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And that seems to me to be right. That is, I think that we ought not always so quickly to succumb to the demand to produce solutions. And in this particular case, I think that if we produce prescriptions prematurely, we run the risk, for reasons that I'll lay out, of reinstating and sort of reenacting the diagnostic stuff, and maybe even making things a little bit worse. Okay, so let's start. We recognize generally in all kinds of other contexts that good things can be overdone, that there could be something that is good, but despite its being good, having too much of that thing, though it is good, is bad. And one very simple case of this, we can get more complicated if you like, but one very simple case of this is cheesecake. And there's a mode of overdoing a good thing like cheesecake that we're all familiar with. That's just called diminishing utility. That is, every bite of cheesecake, no matter how satisfying that bite is, the subsequent bite is a little bit less satisfying. And then at a certain point, cheesecake becomes positively displeasing. Now, it would be a very short talk and a very silly one if the claim were that democracies are like cheesecakes, and they are subject to this rule of diminishing utility. Democracies aren't cheesecakes. They're not like cheesecakes in a relevant sense I can think of. So if democracy is, the thesis that democracy is a good that can be overdone, there has to be another way of having too much of a good thing. And I want to suggest that there is. It's also familiar. What's sometimes called crowding out. You might be familiar with this from discussions of markets and human organs and things, where you talk about motivational crowding out. This is a special, or maybe a more philosophical way of understanding that general phenomenon. Sometimes we can overdo a good thing by allowing its pursuit, or by pursuing it in a way or with such intensity that we expel from the palette of our valuational lives other good things. That's a philosophical way of putting things. One other philosophical way of putting things is to say that sometimes when we overdo a good thing in this crowding out way, not only do we expel from our lives other things that are good, that's just an opportunity cost. Not only do we expel other good things, we expel other good things whose realization or pursuit is, I want to argue, part of the profile or the purpose of the overdone good, if that makes sense. Let me give one very quick example of this. And people have asked me if this is actually a person I knew, if this example is actually a person I know, and it is, though Alice is not her name, but let's just call her Alice. Imagine somebody who decides one day that she's going to pursue optimal physical fitness. Fitness is a good thing. Undeniably, it's good to be physically fit. There are all kinds of benefits that come with being physically fit, but physical fitness is not merely instrumentally good. You might say being fit is something like a non-instrumental good. I don't know if it's intrinsic, but it's non-instrumental. It's good for itself in some sense. That is, its goodness is not strictly like the goodness of money. It might not be an intrinsic good, but it's certainly not purely instrumental. Now, my friend Alice, let's say, pursues physical fitness and achieves some really, really good results. But imagine, and this is actually the case of the person I'm talking about, she pursued her physical fitness at the expense of all of her friendships. That is, her entire life, from the time she woke up and how she got to work and what she did on her lunch break and what she would do with her free time, was given over to the project of her fitness regimen, such that she no longer had time to pursue other hobbies. She wouldn't go to movies. She wouldn't go do the things that her friends and she used to do together, because they didn't contribute to the good that she was pursuing, which was her friendship, which was rather her fitness. Now, this is not a case where I'm asking you to consider somebody overdoing a fitness regimen such that they wind up pulling a hamstring and hurting their body. Alice didn't hurt herself in that way. What happened with Alice was she pursued one good thing to the exclusion or expulsion of anything else that was good in her life, any of the other things that she valued. Eventually played a back seat and then ultimately got thrown out of the back of the car in her life. Now, one of the things that's puzzling about that is, if we went into some more granular detail about Alice, my suspicion is that you would start reaching for diagnostic language. You would start saying, well, that was somebody who was obsessed, right, with her fitness. That was somebody who had some compulsion. She was driven in a way that suggests some psychological force that is something less than properly healthy. Now, and I want you to...
How are you? How are you? Right? How's the university?
I want you to hold on to that thought for a second.
Can you mute?
Yeah, I'm not sure who that is. Okay, I want you to hold on to that thought for a second, that we would see this as a kind of pathology, because, you know, certainly part of what makes fitness the good that it is that fitness enables other good pursuits. That is, you might say, the point of fitness is to enable friendships and sharing enriching experiences with friends, participating in rewarding activities. That's part of the point of the good of fitness. And in fact, just to put it sort of very starkly, you might wonder, surely the point of fitness cannot be the next workout at the gym. That can't be the point of it. That is, again, distorted. That makes the good, again, I would just say pathological, but let's keep it on that. We can talk more about that if you want. So hold on to that thought about crowding out, and the kind of crowding out that's not just about opportunity costs, but the kind of crowding out that involves the expulsion of goods that are, in this sort of odd way, part of the profile or the point of the overdone good. Okay, that's the overdoing that I'm interested in with overdoing democracy. Let's talk about the democracy part. Now, I don't have to tell, I'm sure many of you in this crowd, that although we like to think, or we often think, we don't like to, but we often think about democracy as a certain set of mechanisms and processes and elections and shaking hands and kissing babies and the stuff that's going on virtually in my country right now with the Democratic Convention. democracy is all of that stuff, but that's not ultimately what it is, or that's not centrally what it is, or we might say that's not the really important aspect of democracy. That is, it's very hard, it seems to me, to make sense of those mechanisms and processes and that machinery of democracy unless we see those processes and that machinery in the service of what I want to claim is a moral ideal. That is, democracy is ultimately the ideal of self-government among political equals. Democracy is, in this sense, we might say, an aspiration. We might say that societies count as democratic to the extent that they practically, in tangible ways, pursue this ideal. And that includes recognizing certain kinds of considerations, certain kinds of criticisms of the status quo in politics as having real purchase, and others as not. We can tell that story during Q&A if you want to hear more of my version of it, but I suspect that certainly a lot of the deliberative Democrats in the audience are going to be sort of familiar with these ideas. So the idea is that democracy begins with the moral premise that nobody is another's political subordinate or superior. That is, we're equal citizens. Now, one of the things, again, for a group that's composed largely of some deliberative Democrats, this is also going to be familiar, one of the things that naturally falls out of the ideal of self-government among political equals is the idea that these people are going to disagree. In fact, you might say that's one of the implications, that's one of the ramifications, and it might even be the signal. Right? It's a natural, indispensable byproduct of political equality is that people get to think their own thoughts and make up their own minds and look at the reasons and the evidence and the considerations and figure out what to think about things. They don't always do that, of course, but they get to do it. And so it looks like democracy involves a sort of two-part now, self-government among equals amidst persistent political disagreement. And you could spell out the persistence and the political part in ways that we can talk about during the Q&A. There's a sort of Rawlsian thought that drives this that I think is one of the things Rawls gets right, but we'll leave that as it is. Now, because political disagreements, especially the persistent ones, tend to be about the things that we really care about, or at least the things that we say we think are really important, like justice and liberty and dignity and all the rest. These disagreements are going to involve conflicts between parties where each party is inclined to see the opposing party, the opposing group is all I mean by party here, the opposing, the interlocutor, so to speak, as not merely advocating a suboptimal view or a view that, I myself don't favor, but is, taking the wrong side of the debate. And often taking the wrong side of the debate in these kinds of disputes means taking the unjust side or sort of failing at justice or falling short of it. That is to say that we should expect persistent political disagreement among political equals to be kind of heated and urgent and not always very pleasant and not nice, and certainly not always civil in some senses of that term that sort of understands civility in a way that I would resist, which is civility as being concessive and pleasant and polite and all the rest. So despite that fact, though, despite the fact that equality gets us persistent political disagreement over the things that matter, those disagreements nonetheless are disagreements among equals. Nobody gets to just shout another person down. And so it seems that the democratic ideal is committed to the idea that when we politically disagree, we have to be mindful of the fact that our interlocutors remain our equals. And what that means is that democratic citizenship, democracy more broadly, involves or invokes an ethic of citizenship, right? There's a kind of regard, a kind of treatment, a kind of consideration, in some sense of that word, that the interlocutor, your political opposition, even your political foe, maybe even your political enemy, is nonetheless owed in virtue of the fact that your political opposition remains your political equal and not your subordinate. Okay. Now, I want to sort of gloss over that last point in the following way. We can talk more about it, but what I want to suggest is that democracy's ethic of citizenship involves the cultivation of a set of capacities, dispositions, attitudes, practices. We could spell these things out if you like in the Q&A, that I'm just going to, if you'll allow me, just sort of try to capture with this one term. That's not too far off, I don't think, from other places in which you see it deployed in Rousseau and elsewhere. But the idea of civic friendship, by which I just mean that capacity, well, I have that capacity, those sets of capacities, that collection of attitudes and dispositions and the rest, that we have to have cultivated within ourselves to some threshold degree, such that we are able to regard our political opponents, who we think are on the wrong side of political questions, as nonetheless our political equals. And recognizing them as nonetheless our political equals means we recognize not only that they get an equal say, or that they get an equal slice, how thin it may be, however thin it may be, of equal power, but that they're entitled to an equal share of political power. They're entitled to an equal say. So civic friendship is a lot different from ordinary friendship. The thought is not that in a democracy we have to like each other or be chums. The thought is rather that in political contexts, when democracy is working well, it's possible for me, if I've cultivated the capacity of civic friendship to a due extent, it's possible for me to see you as severely politically mistaken, wrong-headed, on the wrong side of the issues within a very broad spectrum. We could talk about what goes on outside of that spectrum if you like. Within a very broad spectrum, I can see you as misguided, wrong, unjust to a certain degree, and yet nonetheless deserving of an equal say. That's what makes democracy hard, by the way. Okay, so hold that thought. Now we've got two thoughts, right? You can overdo a good thing by doing it in a way that crowds out other essential good things, and democracy involves this ethic of civic friendship. So far, by the way, I don't think I've said anything that's too controversial. So let's look now at the polarization stuff. I want to say that there are two kinds of polarization. Political and belief, as I said out at the beginning. Now, political polarization is the familiar concept that's sort of crept its way into the popular vernacular, at least in the United States. It's not uncommon in the morning political television programs to hear people lament polarization. And although they don't always say what they mean by the term, and it's usually what's depicted there, political polarization is the condition where two identified political groups, be they parties or factions or constituencies, however you want to cash it out, are sort of pulled closer together internally so that the middle ground between them drops out, leaving them with no way to collaborate or cooperate or even in many cases productively communicate with the other side. Now, I'm going to sort of move on very quickly here because, you know, there's a lot that we can say about what's going on in that middle area where the bridge has dropped out and how to measure it and what it's, what's really there. Is it negative affect? Is it, platform, lack of platform overlap? We could talk about, absence of moderates within your group. We can talk about the different ways in which we measure this force. But the result of political polarization, I think, on any of these accounts is deadlock and log jams and a lot of frustration and a lot of resentment and a lot of feeling that the other side isn't adequately invested in democracy at the end of the day. That's a familiar sense of polarization, and maybe it's not the kind of thing that democracy can ever eradicate, and maybe certain forms of it are not so bad after all for democracy. But I want to contrast that with what I want to call belief polarization, which a lot of you will be familiar with from the literature on group polarization. I just think group is a misleading term in this particular context because both senses of polarization are about groups. Remember that, but political polarization is about the distance, we might say, ideological, we could say, or otherwise, between two groups. Belief polarization is an internal phenomenon. It occurs within a like-minded group. And roughly, interaction with like-minded others transforms us into more extreme versions of ourselves. Now, this is a widespread, uncommonly robust social cognitive dynamic. It's been studied, since the 1950s. It's found all over the world. It doesn't seem to discriminate according to level of education or other kinds of markers, the religious belief that you might think would sort of affect people's vulnerability to being pulled along in this way, if that's the right way to think about it. It applies to groups when they have to make a group decision. It applies to groups when they don't have anything particular to decide. It can be found in groups when they're like-minded with respect to some particular value judgment, but it's also found with like-minded groups when the belief with respect, or the commitment with respect to which they're like-minded, is merely factual. Cass Sunstein tells a story, or sort of gives some accounts where, in one of the experiments is a group of people who are convinced that the city of Denver, Colorado is particularly high above sea level. And before they talk together, the experimenter asks each of them to estimate how high above sea level is Denver, Colorado. And they give various answers. And then the experimenter says, do you think Denver could be that much higher? And the answer is, no, it's not that high. But it's this high. And then you get them talking, and not only do they start thinking that Denver is an even higher city than it is, but many of them break the threshold before the deliberation began and start thinking that Denver is higher than they said it could be. And again, there are things with dentist chairs and what's the most comfortable chair and all the rest that we can get into. It's a really interesting phenomenon, and a lot of what has made its way into the popular political idiom about echo chambers and bubbles and filters and in certain contexts algorithms, I think has this worry sort of driving it, that when we exert a certain kind of control over, or when things are arranged such that we are exposed only to people who are similar in certain relevant ways, it does an epistemic job on us, and we become more extreme versions of ourselves. Now, sometimes that extremity means we come to adopt a more extreme successor to the belief we had before we began talking. You think the guy, if he's found guilty, deserves to pay, $20,000. You talk to the other people who think he's guilty, and you think that the infraction is really serious, and then all of a sudden you want the punitive damage, award to climb up to 80,000 very quickly. So sometimes it means more extreme in the sense of coming to hold a more extreme belief content. In other cases, though, it looks like it has more to do with confidence. The degree to which you're confident that your side is right. In other contexts, it looks like it has not to do with confidence, but what's sometimes in philosophy called the degree of belief. That is the probability that you assign to the belief that you have being true. You start off at an 8, you quickly rise to a 9.5. There are lots of tricky issues that have to be spelled out to sort of get the characterization of the phenomenon just right. We can talk about that. But for now, it's enough, I think, just to give it that kind of quick gloss. We turn into more extreme versions of ourselves. Note that as we transform into more extreme versions of ourselves, and although, like I just demonstrated to you, when philosophers talk about this phenomenon, they start thinking about political epistemology and how quickly people change into more extreme belief contents versus more extreme belief degrees versus more extreme confidence in their epistemic perspective. And they start talking like epistemologists, oftentimes forgetting, or at least not attending as carefully as they should, to the fact that one of the ways in which belief polarization turns us into a more extreme version of ourselves is that it impacts our beliefs about the people who are not like-minded. That is, belief polarization in making us more extreme versions of ourselves also encourages us to adopt increasingly negative affect and attitude towards the people that we perceive to be different from us in the relevant respect. So not only does belief polarization impact what we might think of as sort of like our beliefs, the belief that we walked into the room with, as you know, we're going to talk to like-minded others about, but it also impacts our attitudes and dispositions towards the people who are outside of the like-minded group. And in particular, as we belief polarize, we come to adopt, again, more negative attitude. We come to see the other side as suspicious. We come to see their beliefs as irrational. We come to see the people informing those irrational beliefs as irresponsible, benighted, ignorant, in some other way, depraved. And ultimately, we come to see the people on the other side not only, this is bad enough, not only as people who have crazy political ideas that can't be defended in any way and can't be supported by anything that looks like a reason, we do think that, but we also come to see them as contemptible. We come to see them as irresponsible, negligent. That is, the negative assessment of what the other side thinks becomes a negative assessment of what the other side is, of the kind of people who are there. Now, put that together with the bit about the ethic of citizenship that democracy requires of us, and you could start seeing how these things are going to fit together all of a sudden, right? That is, belief polarization erodes the capacities that are constitutive of civic friendship. That's a huge part of the overdoing democracy thesis, that belief polarization erodes the capacities that are in part constitutive of civic friendship. Belief polarization encourages the opposite of civic friendship, civic enmity, turns us into civic enemies. Okay, now all of that is, you know, pretty bad news for democracy. But I want to just now add one additional layer to this. What I call political saturation. In the US, in certain parts of Europe where there's been a lot of work on this, more and more of our daily routines are understood both by us and by others as acts that are politically communicative. That is, more and more of what we do expresses and is received as an expression of our political commitments. In the United States, consumer choices down to where you buy your coffee skew in partisan ways. Republicans drink coffee from Dunkin' Donuts in the States. Liberals drink coffee from Starbucks in the States. What brand of jeans you prefer has a partisan valence. Levi's skew liberal in the United States. Wrangler jeans and Lee jeans skew conservative. How you spend your weekend, how likely you are to have a passport, certainly where you get your news from. The last time you visited a public park. Partisanship is the most reliable indicator of online dating compatibility. In the States, believe it or not, well, I shouldn't tell a group like this, believe it or not, of course you'll believe this. In the States, there is a literature about hot sauce preferences. There is a brand of hot sauce. I know this because I live in Nashville. People are very serious about hot sauce. Barbecue sauce, as it's sometimes called. There's a brand of barbecue sauce that the liberals systematically favor. The number of maps in an average United States citizen's home is positively correlated with how liberal they are politically. Similarly, the number of clocks in the average US citizen's home is positively correlated with how conservative their politics are. More clocks, more conservative. More maps, more liberal. By the way, you can start seeing how some of these things kind of make a weird sort of sense. But more and more of what we do has this expressive function, and in fact has an expressive function because it does express our politics. The clearest way to see this, and in the book I have a discussion of all things tote bags, is just in the United States. I don't know if in Australia you've got these. I'm sure you do. You know, we have these alternative toting mechanisms. They're not paper bags or plastic bags. They're tote bags. They're reusable. Often they have messaging on them that talks about the importance of using reusable bags or environmental messages. Sort of environmentally intoned gourmet grocery store, Whole Foods, their tote bags say something that is oddly analytic. Values matter is what they say on the tote bags from Whole Foods. The MSNBC is a news channel that skews liberal. Its tote bags, which you can go buy online, say, "This is who we are." That's the message on the tote bag. This is who we are. So this idea that your manner of dress, the way you spend your time, the kind of car you drive, where you get your coffee reflects your politics, means that whatever concern or whatever validity you might say attaches to concerns about online echo chambers holds a fortiori in the case of the physical world. The world around us is no less partitioned, sorted according to political profiles than the online environments that we create with the likes and the friends and the thumbs up or whatever anybody else does on social media. I'm only on Twitter. I only know about likes. So the world around us presses us towards creating social conditions that more and more clearly provoke this. We surround ourselves with like-minded people. The person standing next to you online buying groceries is very, very likely to have voted the same way as you in the United States and elsewhere. And as a result, again, in the United States particularly, as the society has become more diverse, more heterogeneous, with respect to all kinds of very promising metrics, race, ethnicity, sexual identification, religious affiliation and conviction, the number of languages spoke at home in addition to English, so on and so forth. As the United States has become more diverse in all of those very encouraging ways, the localities, the local spaces average citizens occupy in their day-to-day lives have become increasingly homogeneous. The society in the aggregate has become more diverse. The social worlds we inhabit have become more politically homogeneous. That creates conditions where we expose ourselves to belief polarization, and that in turn creates conditions where we encourage or we cultivate, we invite civic enmity. So that's what I call the polarization dynamic. Belief polarization creates these, or encourages these attitudes and dispositions that lead us to see the other side as something less than equal, as something not deserving of an equal say, but merely getting an equal say. That in turn leads us to collaborate, confer, interact with only the people around us. That creates more belief polarization. And all the while, I should say, those forces, that is an electorate, a populace that is heavily belief polarized in these ways, according to the kind of political identities that the saturation point helps to encourage, all of that incentivizes the parties and the politicians to punctuate the degree to which they're divided. That is, I want to say that the belief polarization at the level of the citizenry creates a very, very strong incentive, produces a very, very strong strategy, a very clear strategy for winning elections, which is punctuate the differences, valorize intransigence, demonize the other side, make it a virtue to be unconcessive, so on and so forth. All of this obviously is very, very bad news for democracy. So let's put the pieces together. I'm wrapping up here. So just got 4 moves now. Crowding out is a way of overdoing a good thing. Democracy involves this ethic of civic friendship, belief polarization, especially when combined with saturation, undermines civic friendship because political saturation sorts us into these partisan groups and identities in our lives beyond our strictly political behavior. That is, political saturation produces belief polarization. Good. What can we do? Now, I know that the Jane Addams, John Dewey slogan, with which I alluded to at the beginning, the cure for democracy is more democracy, is something near and dear to my heart. It's probably near and dear to many of your hearts. But it seems to me that more democracy can't be the solution to the problem. More political engagement can't be the solution. Decent political engagement, proper political engagement, strikes me as a very, very good strategy for preventing, and maybe even in some contexts for arresting or preventing the exacerbation of existing levels of polarization. There are all kinds of reasons that it's not always a reliable tool, and in fact, it's sometimes a decidedly unreliable tool in that it backfires for depolarizing once polarization has occurred. So the thought is that if we want to do democratic politics well, we need to sustain within ourselves the attitudes and dispositions that will enable us to see our political opposition, even our enemies, as nonetheless our equals. And that means that there has to be some basis for regarding them as our equals that is not wrapped up with the partisan divisions that separate us. For democracy to thrive, we have to see one another as our equals, but in order to do that, we have to see one another as something beyond the political roles that they play, whether they be our allies or our enemies. The trouble isn't that some anti-democratic force, at least the trouble I'm pointing to, isn't that some anti-democratic force has infiltrated. It's that in our good faith efforts to do democracy well, to enact our politics, to live our politics, we create conditions that actually erode the capacities that enable us to do democracy well. The solution is desaturation. We have to find things to do together that aren't activities where we bracket off our political differences or suppress them. I'm not talking here about bipartisan softball leagues, although, I don't have an opposition to that, seems fine, right? Not talking about that. I'm saying we need to find things to do together that are cooperative, but nonetheless are not at all organized around our political allegiances, our political identities. We need to find things to do together where politics is strictly beside the point. It's just not part of the endeavor. It's not the thing that's there, but we're not talking about it. It's just not part of what's happening in the activity. Now, I know the book came out in November. I've been talking a lot about it. I know people think this is a bizarre idea. People say it's a dangerous idea. Nobody hears it and gets on board, or very few people hear it and get on board. I want to say this very quickly. The idea that we have a hard time even imagining a pro-social cooperative endeavor that's not organized around politics is not the counterexample to the thesis I want to submit to you. It's a statement of the problem. That's how the extent to which overdoing democracy has colonized our imaginative spaces socially. Now, if it strikes you still that the very idea of a non-political cooperative endeavor is some kind of puzzle, just ask yourself the question, just like in the fitness case. We asked what's fitness for? It can't be more workouts. Democracy can't be for more politics. That is, I want to submit to you, and this is where I'll end, What makes democracy so important and so precious is that it promises us a stable and relatively just social order that can be improved upon in various ways with our efforts, in which individuals can live lives devoted to values that they live from the inside, that may or may not have anything to do with politics. That is a part of what democratic politics is for, is to enable people to live valuable lives together, devoted to collective projects that involve things like love and care and looking after and nurturing and support and collaboration and creativity that might not involve anything political at all. When we lose sight of the possibility of lives of that kind, when we lose sight of the fact that part of the good of democracy is that it creates social and political conditions that enable lives devoted to things other than the next campaign, the next election, the next policy win. We lose sight of that. That's what overdoing democracy is. And when we overdo democracy, we damage the capacities within ourselves to do democracy well. So as paradoxical as it may sound, in order to do democracy well, in order for democracy to thrive, sometimes we need to find something else to do together. Thanks. Did people clap on Zoom? I don't know, but I appreciate that.
Very good.